I interpreting right now? Good evening. This is Kavita Papelia. I'm CAD president, and I'm happy to host tonight's event, Deaf World CODAs, Navigating Generational Trauma and Healing. Before we start, there are two things that I want to recognize. Is this month of March is to recognize and honor women, all women. Hats off to all women. Also want to acknowledge the recent shootings and victims who have lost their lives, loved ones, lost family members, and people. And we also want to recognize AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders. And through the, we give our, I can't see her, our condolences. Now I'd like to explain the ground rules for today's presentation. We have panelists that will be asked questions, and each will have a turn. They will have voice interpreters or sign interpreters based on their individual preference. Audience members who are watching us, number one, please, no negative remarks or comments or any type of harassment will not be tolerated. We will have those who will ask questions will be relayed to our panelists, and that will be moderated by Grace Body, who is also a CODA, who will take your questions and interpret them to the panelists, and each will have a turn to respond. If you would like to sign your question, please let our moderators know, and then they will spotlight you and give you the Zoom ID and password so that you may enter the room and sign your question. We will also have a commercial break after the questions, and then we will go to Q&A for the audience. Now I'd like to introduce each panelist, and we will start with Sarah Cardinelli. And then we'll go on to Oral, Vincent, and Paula. All are amazing, beautiful CODAs, beautiful people. Welcome to our CAD platform, tonight's event. The first question is, tell us who you are. Please share about your background. And anyone who wants to start,
this is Sarah.
Just raise your hand.
This is Sarah. I'll go ahead and start for tonight. My name is Sarah Cardinale, and this is my name sign, S on my cheek. And I'm a CODA. My father is deaf. My mom is hearing, as well as an interpreter. And so I grew up with deaf culture, and we socialized within the deaf community. And currently, I do work as a sign language interpreter. And I'd like to say I'm very grateful to be on the panel tonight. Thank you for having me, Kavita.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
I'll go next. I have my hand up. I guess I'm next. Good evening, folks. Hi. Near and far. Hello, hello. I am Oral Parejas. And I'm also a CODA. I was born and raised in the Los Angeles area. I also have worked as a professional interpreter for over 13 years now. And I identify as Latino. I was in the DC area for a brief time, well, not really brief, 8 years. And then I returned to California, and I'm now in the Riverside area.
Vincent or Paula?
Hi, I'm I'm Vincent. My name sign is Vinny with an R. My sister, the oldest, she took the V, and in my family, my mother is 5 generations deaf, and we have name signs that were generational, and so all of her kids are signed with their hands moving. So my oldest sister is Victoria, there's Zenobia, there's Daryl, and I'm Vinny with an R because she took the V. I grew up in Oakland. It was very vibrant deaf community because the deaf schools in Berkeley. But I grew up having a wonderful experience being submerged in the deaf community. I I went off to college and got degrees in a separate field than deafness because there's 5 generations. All my aunts, uncles, grandparents, everybody was deaf. I wanted something different, but something that fit with the way my mind worked. And so I'm a biochemist and I have degrees in that field.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paola, and you can say Paola. So that's how you say my name. So I was born in Mexico City, but I grew up there until my parents are deaf, obviously. My mother's Mexico, and my father is from
Nicaragua.
Nicaragua. And I grew up with 3 languages: Spanish, but LSM is my first language. Then it's Spanish and then English. And then we moved to the United States here in the state of California. And I grew up primarily in Los Angeles area, the city of Inglewood. And I was able to pick up American Sign Language and be part of the deaf community in Southern California. And I think the fourth thing is I work as an interpreter here. Probably this year, I will be celebrating as a practitioner for 20 years. I'm involved in various different activities, involved in the deaf community, Deaf World, the CODA world. And I'm also here this evening to share that with you. You all are amazing people with amazing backgrounds. Wow, such wonderful. That's so beautiful. I will have a question for you. What is your generational strengths as CODAs? Anybody want to start first?
This is Sarah speaking. I'll go ahead and start again, if no one minds. With that question asked, I have a lot of things that come to mind as far as my strengths as a coach. Well, I did have the benefit of being a part of the deaf world and picking up sign language. I'm bicultural, I'm bilingual, and that experience in totality has influenced my world outlook. Anywhere I go, anywhere I travel, whether it be local, to the store, or anything I do, I see it through the lens of being a CODA, which incorporates the deaf perspective. As CODAs, we share those deaf eyes, which means that I always have access on my mind. I'm always wondering how culture applies. And I wonder if the situation I see before me would fit into the deaf culture. And so I'm always being primed by thoughts like that. They're always on my mind. And I see a similar application to other experiences in life, whether it be in employment or in social settings or out in the community. And I have that perspective with me all the time. And I think it's a huge benefit to me. And overall, it makes me more human and more personal. And I'm grateful to have been involved with the deaf community all my life. When I travel, well, I should say I love traveling. So when I'm out on a trip or out and about, I also notice that I have more comfort and I don't mind taking on a new culture, taking on a new language and trying to learn a bit of it because I already have that experience of being bicultural and I'm extremely grateful for it.
Would you like to add any more to that question? I'm sorry, go ahead, Oral.
Right, this is Oral speaking. I'd like to add and echo much of what Sarah just said. For me, I feel a sense of identity. I feel that as well as a sense of independence or autonomy where I can move forward with agency. In the past, uh, of course, both of my parents are deaf and Latino, but both come from Mexico as well. And in the past, I embraced the culture and incorporated it. I'm also firstborn out of the 5 children. And it's given me a strong sense of identity within the Latino culture. And as ASL, American Sign Language, is my primary language, I've been able to meld both because I have a foot in both worlds, the Latin world and the CODA identity world. And I admit, I was a bit standoffish at first. And it was tough for me to really get a full understanding of what both identities meant, as well as incorporate them. But once I did in life, I think it wasn't until I took a college course on deaf culture. Once I had that course, I was really able to make progress, as well as my time spent in the ITP program, the interpreter training program. Through exposure to both of those, I really broadened my understanding. And I must say, I was somewhat limited before, but I took off all the blinders and really opened up my eyes. And I was just overwhelmed with the abundant amount of diversity and presence to the culture. But when I look back and reflect on it, it really ties into identifying with both of those identities.
Yes,
Well,
Vinny or Paula,
I
this is Paula. Um, I think generational strengths from what I feel that I have is being able to not feel limited and being able to have an open mind, to be able to have an open heart and be able to facilitate between the two. And what benefits me is in my everyday life. Oftentimes, when I'm conversing with others and I see different perspectives, and especially when those who have differences, I can express in a way to help them understand and also to facilitate between the two. And I think that's this generational strength that I have and to navigate through it and getting through life. It's not always easy for the deaf community and deaf members in general for people, but to be resilient, to be supportive. I myself, my autonomy, how forthright I am, the values of from our deaf culture that's carried within me. That's a huge benefit. I think that's about it for now.
so I'm not going to sign if you don't mind. So growing up, I I thought as a kid I was just your normal kid, and looking up all the adults in my life, my parents, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, everybody at the deaf club was deaf. And I recall being about 4 years old, I was talking to my mom and just saying, when I grow up and become deaf, and and my mom looked at me and she said, "No, you're hearing. You can hear. You're not going to be deaf." And that was like a earth-shattering moment for me. I tell the story to friends that it was when I was in the backyard with my mother. She was signed to me, and being just a beautiful, incredible signer. She was so graceful and just poetic in her signs. And she was explaining, the new flowers and the colors and everything was going on, just introducing all these wonderful signs to me and talking about there is a butterfly that she noticed. And she was saying how beautiful it is and tell me that it basically was a caterpillar and it was in a chrysalis. And in the chrysalis, it then grew out of that and became a butterfly and flew. And she was pointing at that and telling me this story. And then she asked me, "What sound, what music is the butterfly making?" And it was like at that moment, I looked and I was just stunned. It just sunk in on me that my parents, my family, are deaf. And it was like there's an expression, the butterfly effect, where um, a meteorologist explained in a thesis about a butterfly flapping his wings in Texas, causing a tornado in Thailand. And that was my butterfly effect. It changed my life and the way I look at the world. And I look at the world as a coda. And I tell that to people, and they look at me and they go, "What does that mean?" And I tell people that codas, our minds, are engineered to problem solve, to fix things. And I'm an engineer, and I know that when Sarah was telling her story, we have the same story. We think the same way. When I was in school, the teachers would tell me in instruction, have your parents do A, B, C, and D. Well, everybody in the class could follow that. But as a little 5-year old, 6-year old, 7-year old, I was the one that had to re engineer these instructions so that I could get my parents involved because there was no TTYs, there's no TDDs, there's no video phones, there's nothing. And so, how was that going to happen? So, it was all done by CODAs. We were like the first VRS. And I just have such a great, wonderful experience growing up with that because I'm involved in discussions with people and they talk to me. Today we're talking about a mind map. And that's where a concept is written, and then from that you have branches from that all relate to that one subject. And if you ever get into a great room of deaf people, one person will have a key topic, but you have such beautiful stories that everyone else will add to that. And you get, it's so incredible. It's wonderful. So I don't want to take up more of this. There's so many better codas on the stage. So let me pass it over.
I think that's very beautiful. That's pretty standard. It's a common experience. It also applies in our deaf world too. In our, we go on and on and on. It's just part of the deaf culture experience. That's what's intuitive to you. That's just part of you and your identity. We have codas and we have our coda part and our deaf part. I mean, that's just how we are. So you don't have to apologize for that. Yeah, Paula. Chris.
I feel a little more settled now. Another one of my generational strengths that I'd say we share collectively is relationship building. Relationship building between the identities that exist in the deaf world and that spectrum, because there's deaf, deaf blind, deaf plus, deaf with hard of hearing, deaf with disability, hard of hearing, CODA, GODA, SODA, and the list goes on. There are is such a spectrum of identity. We become experts at navigating those relationships. And so that's how we're able to focus on healing that generational trauma. CODAs can have that openness to consider what it is that the deaf are trying to input and connect that into a healing journey. Younger CODAs, kids, CODAs, they might feel off because they're different, being the hearing child in a deaf family. And we need to identify with them and be the bridge so that they can have that self-esteem, so that they can be proud of their identity, of their background and their childhood, and realize how cool it is and how they can be proud of it and how they can move forward in any field in life and take any path they want, so long as they have the support of the community, which consists of us here. And so I think one of our strengths is being able to support each other and provide that momentum for personal growth.
Thank you. I agree with all of you about how CODAs have their generational strengths as CODAs. And I always think of CODAs and always, how they have such a wonderful connection and relationship to the deaf community. It's a very strong relationship. Oral, Sarah, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that question? If not, then we can move on to the next question.
This is Sarah Kavita. I think I'm good. We can move on to the next question.
This is Oral.
This is Oral.
Not right now at this moment, but I am thinking about moving on. Let's go on to the next question. It's fine. Okay, are you ready? I think we have the next moderator is going to be Grace. Grace Body is now going to take over and ask the next series of questions. Please welcome Grace Body. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and ask the questions. We have some technical difficulties and we can't bring Grace on right this moment. We have some technical difficulties at the moment, and I apologize. Please stay with us. Just one moment. So I'm curious, what are your memories growing up as a CODA? When did you first, at what age do you feel that you finally understood and identified yourself as a CODA? For me, when I first noticed, I think it was a moment where I learned, first of all, the first time that I thought, oh, okay, when I had a hearing friend that came over to my house. And my friend asked me, said, oh, your dad's deaf? Oh, that's interesting. And asked me a lot of questions about my dad. And that's when I realized, oh, that the world does not know about deaf culture. Why does our lights go off and on, flashing? The phone, the doorbell, it's all connected to visual lights in the house. That piqued her curiosity. And I thought, oh, well, to me, that was normal. So I think that was one moment that came to mind where I realized that our family's different. And the second time is the first time I went to a deaf camp. It's a deaf CODA camp. And that's where I really realized, wow, I met other CODAs like myself. And I also met other deaf kids my age, you know. It was always a deaf adults that I was exposed to, like my father, my father's friends. And I thought, oh, okay, but never met a deaf peer the same age as I was. And I thought that was really cool. So I think it was, and also when I first met CODAs, when I went to Camp 2, to help me understand more about our shared experiences and how unique that is and how much similarities and viewpoints that we can share and the challenges as well. So the benefit is being able to meet other CODAs and feeling like, wow, I'm not alone anymore. And I have a community where we're understood and understand how our lives are in the hearing world. So I think it was those two experiences. So for camp, that was definitely the case for me. Oral?
Right. I'll go ahead and go next. I gave some thought to this question, and memory I have in particular, I would say when I was young, I don't know, maybe elementary school age, I must have been 4, 5, maybe even 6. During that time, I was in a speech therapy class. And I remember everything that the speech therapist thought, right? Putting my hand on my neck to pronounce my vowels, pronouns, everything that they cover in speech therapy with that practice. And I was taking it all in. And I remember making sure that I caught it. Then I went home and I was telling my mom about my experience. I said, Mom, why don't you try this? So anything I received through the speech therapy, I brought home and shared it with my mom. And I realized that she had an issue. She wasn't able to emulate the sound I was making. And I really had to start thinking about that. And then I became a little frustrated because I thought, is she really deaf? Is she not deaf? I don't think I had the concept of what being a CODA was or what being a part of the deaf world was. I didn't have that concept. It was just my regular daily normal life, right? And so my mom finally said, you know, even though you teach me, I'm deaf. I can't speak. I won't speak. I'm going to fail at this. And that was when I had the realization, and that's when it really hit home. And I realized at that point, there's something different about mom. That's a really strong memory of mine. And another resilient memory that stands out is I went to college, and my college was Mount San Antonio College. There, I took a class on deaf culture in the interpreter training program and so on. It's a part of the curriculum there. There was a professor there by the name of Miss Jenkins. And in the class, they were talking about the interpreting process and what that looks like for deaf people, just in general. And so we paired up in class. and one person had to watch the other partner while the partner looked behind them. And so there was a video playing, a person watched it, and then the first person that watched the video made notes to try to make an interpretation of the video, right? So that person that was looking away after the video was over now switched positions. And so when it was my turn to make notes with what matched up on the video, we were putting that together to focus on the interpreting process of capturing information and processing that. And I remember my partner didn't capture everything visually. They missed some items. Whereas in the exercise, I caught most of that visual information. I wouldn't say I caught all of it, but I caught most of it. And the score was based on the partners. So whoever scored the lowest, that was the score that was taken. I was a little upset because I felt it was unfair. But the teacher then explained to me to keep in mind that if there was another interpreter interpreting for my parents, that's how my parents would feel. And that point really hit home. And throughout the years that I had been interpreting for them and they relied on me, I started looking back and thinking I wasn't enough. I could have done better for them. And I really identified with that sense. And I decided moving forward that I would invest 100% of my efforts in interpreting professionally and accurately. And so, yeah, those are two very outstanding memories of mine.
Thank you. Who's next? Want to share their story and their experience about the first time they identified themselves as being deaf? I mean, CODA.
Or both. So my experience is I was in a situation where I always felt like I was being put in a box. And people, when they would meet me, they would think, well, you have deaf parents, you belong in this box. But if they didn't know that I had deaf parents, they would put me in another box. Or if they met me in school, in college, they would put me in a geek box. I would be in all kinds of different boxes. And that's where I was trying to break out of. I was trying to break out of the idea of being considered in a box when people didn't understand who I was. And I had a weird experience. And I think, you know, being a CODA, I had many weird experiences. So this is just one of them. And it was a time I was in high school, and the teacher pulled down this little, you know, it wasn't a map, it was the periodic table. And I looked at that, and the teacher was so excited to explain about the different characteristics in the periodic table. But I was looking at it of people thought I was in a box, and I was trying to figure out, well, what box would I fit in on the periodic table? And looking at it, it had metals, it had non-metal, but there was a strand in the middle that shared both properties, and it's called a metalloid. Metalloid. And what a metalloid is, it's a coda. Now, there's various different elements in a metalloid, but what a metalloid is, basically, it shares property in both the metal category of elements and the non-metal. And looking at that, it was like I found a place. I found the box that I belong in. To me, that was very empowering because I could say, you know what? I'm not weird. I'm not strange. You put me in a box, but you know what? I'm in a metalloid box. And half the people I run into didn't know what the hell a metalloid was. And I thought, well, you know, who cares? I know my place now. So I guess the trauma in our topic was more towards the hearing population trying to figure out what to do with me because I already knew where I belong.
Yes, Paula. This is Paula. I know what that relationship is for my kin, and I know who my people are. And so growing up in Mexico, I looked around my family, my extended family, my friends, and I thought, oh, in my world, being part of the deaf community and the frequent gathering and events was normal. It's like a deaf club. We gather, we attend many, many events, and that's normal to me. My interactions within the deaf community, that was normal to me. I didn't feel different. I was like, you know, hearing is different. I'm not hearing, I'm deaf. It wasn't until years and years later that I understood more. In Mexico, growing up, they don't call me hearing, because in Mexico, it's very different. The perception is that it's a social linguistic viewpoint, not a medical viewpoint. So I grew up understanding how my mother would introduce me. She would say, "This is my daughter." And this is the sign for that. And they said, people would say, "Oh, that's your daughter." And that means, does she talk? And the reply would always be, "She signs." But she can talk, but she speaks Spanish and then she signs in LSM. And that was it. And talking about the potential of being able to talk or sign in either language. At that time, of course, I only knew two languages at that time, but it wasn't until later on when I came to the States I learned ASL and English. But they weren't obsessive with my audiological status. It was about my social and cultural status, because our family's deaf, our friends are deaf, caretakers, grandparents are all deaf. And that's just part of my identity in my life. And then years later, when I was first exposed to CODA, is when I went to the interpreter training program, and I didn't know there was a term for that, of people like me. And then I found out at that time, about 20 years ago, then they say, oh, second or third language learners, it's not a hereditary language. Like for me, in my experience, I was exposed and around a lot of L2 learners who are learning sign language as an adult, not as their native heritage language. But I didn't have that kind of conflict or feeling. But when they were successful in doing what they are in their work, but then they would say, oh, you're a CODA. Well, you're not really trained. You're not really a professional. You wouldn't be considered that. Hearing interpreters who are non-native to ASL, they also would make accusations and saying, oh, well, it came easy to you. You're a CODA, you had deaf parents, and you didn't have to learn it in the way that they had to learn it. So that was their beef. That was their problem. But it's just part of my life experience. Of course, it's the native language, the heritage language. It's a language that your parents teach you. But it wasn't until I met Carla. Carla is a Gary. And she is another CODA too. I met her during a workshop training for trilingual interpreters. So there was deaf interpreter training. I think it was in 2006 or 2007, but it was the same track of training that happened to be, it took place back in Midland, Texas, I believe. So that's where I had met her. And I remembered I was there for about a week or two. So I attended this conference and we just got together and we were just talking and talking and talking. And she says, Paula, you need to come to CODA conference. You need to come to the international conference. You're going to meet so many people all over the world that are CODAs with multi-identities. And I said, sure, that sounds fabulous. So I went to the next international conference. I bought my ticket and I went and I started attending more. And then fast forward to 2014. Wait, let me think. I would say it was around 2014. That's correct. I met a lot of other Latin Americans, CODAs as well. It was, wonderful. Then we have OPAs and two HOPIs, that means children of deaf parents in South America. So I just thought, oh, wow, that's amazing. So that's my exposure, knowing, understanding that CODAs is international. Thank you for sharing that, Paola. And now I would like to be able to introduce to the audience and to the panelists is Grace Body. She will be the moderator who will now take over and ask you further questions. And then I'll come back once we've completed the event. Grace? Hello, everyone. Can you guys see me? Panelist members out there and internet land. The next question is, growing up, you have the understanding that you already realize that you're a CODA, that there is hearing world and then there's the deaf world, but navigating through that. And the third world is being CODAs. What did you do? What were some of the things that you did growing up, but not just growing up, but now? Do you work as an interpreter in the deaf field? Tell us about your journey and what you do now. This is Sarah. I've been an interpreter for a while, very involved in the deaf community. I don't think that I wouldn't be involved if I wasn't an interpreter, perhaps. Because I do have other things and interests that I like. I write a blog and I'm very passionate about that. And I'm always thinking about things to make sure that, does it meet the perspective of the deaf community of what I share and the knowledge I like to express and share. I started interpreting when I was 18 and I always knew that I wanted to be involved in some way. And I never felt like, oh no, I don't want to be any part of the deaf community and I just want to get out and be part of the hearing world. But I do understand and realize it is a challenge, to be accepted and welcome in the deaf community. Yeah, there have been some experiences where I've seen that happen. I had a person who asked a question, say, oh, you're a CODA. So, that means, deaf culture stops with you. So does that mean that when you get married or have children that you're not going to have any more deaf children? So it just stops with you, I thought, well, no, there are some CODAs that have other feelings about that and they have children that are deaf and pass it on, or if they're CODAs themselves. We do educate our children. I do want to educate my child about the deaf community and grow up with the language and the culture and appreciate and value that. I think that's one way that we can balance that between both worlds and to make sure that we continue on and provide information, inform people when we can, and lead by example and show what you mean, what it means as a CODA, what it means about deaf culture, and have pride in that and profess, positivity out in the world of who we are in our communities. Wow, I always think about that too. I think about if I have children, will my children know sign? Are they, be able to communicate with my parents? And I want that. And I was fearful of that because I thought, oh, I'm going to be a CODA and I do that right now, but my children won't be CODA. But if I marry a hearing person and we have children, or if I marry a deaf person, then yeah, they'll be a CODA. But I thought, no, it doesn't matter if my children are not CODA. They can still learn and we can still teach them and still be part of our community. I agree too with that. Grace. Thank you. Okay, anybody wants to go next? Oral?
Right. I'll go next. That is a profoundly good question to ask. How I navigate both worlds? My response is through a lot of frustrations while doing it. I didn't even know what CODA meant or that that was an identity growing up. And it was a tough thing to balance because I did notice, for example, my parents would give me advice, right? We know in the deaf culture, when you are playing around, just moting each other, or when you want to play around with someone, or when you're being direct, right? I picked all that up. And so when I was at school, I would react like that to my hearing counterparts at school. I would just be so blunt and so direct and so forward with them and point things out. And of course, they thought I was a jerk. And then I realized at that point, hold on, you got to tone it down, Oral. And you got to figure out why it is mom and dad are teaching me this, but it's not working out in the hearing world. And so I started realizing, well, hearing people are telling me that this behavior means X to them. Well, why don't I work on redefining my behavior with them so things can settle down with the hearing community? But then from my parents' perspective, they noticed and they said, what's going on with you? You're becoming more hearing. And so for me, it was a constant struggle of figuring out where the balance was and where that threshold was. And it was through my experiences, through my behavior, through my humanity that I was able to gauge and ebb and flow throughout those changes in my life. And it always caused me to feel a bit awkward or a bit unsure. Also, because I speak Spanish, that Latino identity portion, I wasn't sure about my Spanish. My Spanish speaking family all speak Spanish, right? So, of course, my first language was American Sign Language, and I couldn't even roll my R's. I couldn't get a good R out, and I didn't have that fluency in Spanish. I always stammered a bit, which meant that, of course, my relatives teased me, and I think they traumatized me just a bit and made me a little more fearful. So, again, I withdrew and I decided to avoid people a little bit more. But then I realized, okay, I can't just withdraw from family. I've got to learn a little more Spanish. So I took the time to do that for myself. And as I grew up and I became a teenager in high school, I noticed that I really tried avoiding my family because of the stress of their reliance on me. It, 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 it was heavy. It was a lot for me to carry. I am the oldest, the firstborn in a Latin family, which means that I take on all responsibilities. So, in any situation when my parents lacked access to information, when any situation that required in depth information, it was just normal for them to move along and put that on me. So, there was a lot of frustration. There was a lot of tough times. And I did become reliant on drugs. I did try to self medicate via smoking weed. That was my escape. That's as a teenager, right? I tried to rebel. I got in trouble. And that's what I thought would help me feel better. And now I do have a sense that because I'm educated and I've gone through college and I have that relationship with the interpreter world as well as the deaf world, I'm involved with the community. I have the whole spectrum in my life. I feel like my ability to balance navigating both worlds has really improved, and I feel very successful at straddling both worlds.
That's great that you were able to find some peace with it and that you could go out into both worlds. I feel it's hard for me. Sometimes I feel conflicted, with various different groups that I'm with. I know when I went to CODA West as a camp for CODAs, the first time that I went there, I thought, oh wow, this is cool. I'm gonna join a whole bunch of group of CODAs, and then when it's done, I'm gonna go home and then hang out with my hearing friends. And I felt, ooh, I don't want to hang out with them anymore. I want to go back and hang out with just CODAs only, but we can't, we can't always just live in a world that's all CODAs. We're part of the bigger world of hearing people. So we have to be able to kind of switch, if you will, cultural switching and matching and who, depending on the group that I'm involved with. So Paula or Vince, do you guys want to share anything? I'm sorry, we can't hear you, Vinny.
Okay, let me go before Paula because she has better stories than me. I don't, so I let her finish. But I do want to share um, my experiences growing up, and I really didn't think of it as two different worlds, the deaf world or the hearing world, because I was I, I was enmeshed in both. And my best friend growing up, he was deaf from a strong deaf family, but we were the best buddies growing up. And remember when we were getting older, he was deaf from deaf, and everybody he saw from kindergarten, first grade, all the way up to the high school was the same people. He didn't have any new girls to flirt with. And I'm just saying that because he was jealous that I could flirt with all these hearing girls. So my life, I wasn't the interpreter. I was Cyrano to my friend, Cyrano de Bergerac. And he and I would go out and we'd be on Telegraph Avenue and we would be chatting with these girls. I would be signing back and forth with them and I would introduce him because he's very shy. He's going up to a hearing girl, but I would, and then lo and behold, he would put on his charm and they would hook up, they would meet, have a great time. He'd go back to the deaf school and the dorms, and everybody wanted me to interpret they wanted to hook up with all these hearing girls, and I said no. I'm only I'm doing this because he's a friend I grew up with. He's my friend who I told I had to explain that farts make sound, and he had no idea. His sister couldn't hear, his parents couldn't hear, my parents couldn't hear, and I would tell him, I said, when you're farting, when you're going to rip one, it makes a loud sound. And he said, really? I said, yeah. So he was so thrilled. He would go out and he would rip one at the deaf school and and he would tell everybody, that is huge sound. And he was so just connected with me because I treated him as a friend. And I know that, he went to school, he had computer skills, and that was his field. And when he was going on a job interview, he would look at me and say, I hate to ask the company, oh, by the way, I want to interview this job for an engineering position. Can you be my interpreter or can you get an interpreter for me? He wanted first to have a foot in the door. And so what I did was I would interpret with them. I'd be his interpreter. And it was more not that I was donating my interpreting because I respected his computer skills. And he knew and I knew I was interpreting for him so he could get the job, but I needed work on my computer. So it was more of like we were equals. And I think that was the whole experience growing up was that I didn't see myself as being separate, being CODA. I felt I was part of the community. I was an equal. I could hear, but I had certain things in my life I can't do, and certain things that he can do that I can't do that can compensate for me. So it was a great relationship.
Wow, that's a great feeling. I wish I had more deaf friends myself where I live, but unfortunately, I'm not able to meet that many where I live. But You're so fortunate to have that. So I'm very happy to hear that story. It's a funny story about the farting.
I was lucky.
Yes, you are lucky.
Plus, he knew I knew when he was farting too, so he was being careful around me.
That's funny. Paula? Yes, it's a rich experience. You know, I, I love it.
Smelly too.
You know, that reminded me about navigating, talking about, navigating between our deaf worlds and all the other worlds that we're parts of. For me, I was part of the Spanish speaking world. And so I would be involved there in this English speaking world, but specifically it depends on, Mexico and Spanish, culture, our values, the Nicaraguan language and culture. And then here in the United States, you have your own. But again, this was my world and what I was navigating through. So not everyone was equal. When I was growing up, in the summer, I would fly back with my mom and we would go back to our home country in the summer, visiting family and friends. And then my mom would have to go back to work and I would stay the whole summer, of course. I got to stay there. And then later on, my siblings, as we got older, and then it was my younger siblings' turns to be able to fly back to Mexico and visit with family and stay with family. When I was 15, I had my, in Nicaragua, I went there for my Sweet 15 party with my family. I would grow up visiting both countries. My relationships, at that time in that world, it was all about, oh, they noticed the behavior. Because when you're young, it's hard to remember so much. But I'm sure that I was frustrated, having and being stressed because I felt a sense of facilitating or brokering through the different various languages, being responsible for that. Am I bitter about any of that? No, I don't. I would not say I was at all because I would see what was happening and I cared so much that I wanted to help and I would spontaneously just jump in and start brokering language between languages for my family. And as I'm going through life, my behavior was much more like, hey, Paula, tapping or touching each other visually, doing things like that, with human touch. Whereas that was very acceptable in our deaf world, right? But it wasn't in the hearing world. And we are more physical and affectionate, but that's not considered appropriate in the hearing world. It was very interesting seeing that and having to navigate and remember how to behave depending on which group I was with, speaking English in one group and speaking Spanish in another group, or LSM and ESL. And, sometimes I have one example I can share. I mean, there's just too many. I just can't remember one specific thing, but I just remember feeling something that was, they were saying, oh, you're odd, you're a CODA. And I would meet other CODAs. When they started describing the same exact experiences that I was going through, then it was like, wow, validation. It wasn't like that's me, that I was only one, that was, and people would tap on me and I would look away. And even though I was speaking or whatever, or I can't hear something, or, or I'll take in information and let it go out, I wouldn't really like retain it. That's just, my mom, she would ask me, hey, what are they saying, whatever. And I would look and I would know, automatically code switch. Those little things that makes me different. And people thought that I was strange or odd because of how I navigate. And because of my identity, it was different. And storytelling, oh my gosh. My friends were like, Paula, get to the point. Where are you going from A to Z? I'm like, well, then I had to learn. I had to learn, oh, okay, I can't explain A to Z to when I'm with hearing friends or hearing world. And sometimes I'm like, I'm too tired that I don't care. And then they get used to me after a while and then they don't mind. But then it's very interesting through that experiences, there are a lot of deaf parented interpreters, heritage signers, or deaf interpreters, and on a in our personal lives versus our professional lives, what is it? We do have to sometimes keep that separate, and but sometimes that overlaps though. And I try to remind myself and keep myself, okay, all right, I got to keep some boundaries. Some are flexible, some are not. And I got to remember those things because I live in distinct, different worlds, and I have to maintain that mutual respect and trust. That trust is very important, because you work and you live in the same world. I don't share, of course. They're very concerned. CODAs are part of the deaf world, but then we're professional interpreters. Can we maintain confidentiality? That's very important. That you have to continue to keep that and earn their trust. So if I go to meetings, or let's say there's an announcement, for Native Americans, indigenous peoples. So we recognize the land, and that's important to me because from Mexico and Nicaragua, and Latins, we have three very strong roots. One is we are indigenous, also the African community, and also European, the Latin community. But Europeans, as they come, they're colonizing us, and we have to look back and we have to see, what is it? Yes, we do have more. Maybe our families are, our older generation family members don't have that, because there's so much history that's deep into what has, transpired, and that information is not there. It's missing. So I recognize my indigenous roots and my heritage within that. But it's still a journey. I'm still constantly learning. And I don't think we ever stop as CODAs, especially if you're multi ethnic and CODAs as well.
This is Grace. Right. As CODAs, we do have many facets in life to learn about. We learn about deaf culture as well as hearing culture, and then our own CODA culture. And I think, Paola, what you said was very interesting and, of course, very unique as well. I appreciate your share. I appreciate the panel share. Everything everyone has said here is appreciated. And at this moment, we are going to take a brief break. We're going to have our intermission with a short commercial break. And folks, we'll start that intermission now. We'll be back in just a bit.
Metaloid. I need to get you a shirt. CODA.
Hey, Grace. So I'm able to pin now. So when I pin someone, so I can voice for them. But just give like a second before you talk. So when they're finished talking, then just 1 second. We're live. Oops. All right. Oh my gosh. So now, one of the goals and one of the things that, well, what are some of the things that you wish that the hearing world knew and what the deaf world knew about CODAs? CODA children and CODA adults. And who wants to start? Who wants to start? I'll let someone else go first. Vinny?
So let me just voice this. The interpreter is fantastic. What I can remember growing up, the deaf clubs were packed. I remember it's like 300 people would be at the deaf club, and it was such a diverse group. Everybody was there, of all races, all capabilities. There were people there that who were also disabled, all education levels, and everybody had kids, and we all played together. And I would play with a CODA, and their parents were peddlers. They sold the ABC cards, but it was very empowering. And my parents' house, they had 6 bedrooms, and my dad was a huge supporter of the deaf community. His parents didn't sign. I can remember being a young kid being very frustrated that they didn't ever have a conversation with his parents, didn't have a conversation with their own son, my father. And I look at my mother's family, and everybody signed. And it was that feeling I had, thinking, what is going on? And when people look at me and they say, well, you're a CODA, meaning you have deaf parents, wasn't that sad? And my favorite question is, what was it like to have parents that couldn't hear? And I would look at them, and I knew how their parents treated them. And I would say, well, what's it like having parents that always yelled at you? What's it like with parents that always, and I would be that kid who had a comeback, because I'd be that angry CODA.
Molly, you're on mute.
I can appreciate that, Vinny. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I'd like to share is
Yes.
that when somebody was in an abusive relationship, when somebody lost their job, someone just was having just a tragedy in their life, we always had a place for them. And I didn't know what our house was called growing up, but it was. If you look at it now, it was a respite house, and we we gave a respite, a place for someone to get back on their feet, and not have to worry. And this is what the deaf community did. This is the power of the deaf community, because everybody in the deaf community was looked upon as equal. That's what I saw. And the only thing that I saw as anybody that's being oppressive were hearing people. And I'd look at myself and I said, am I that? And it's like, no, I don't have those traits. I had great role models.
So who was your primary role model that you felt as a CODA?
Well, some people might know the name Leo Jacobs, and he
Can you explain who Leo Jacobs is?
Leo Jacobs was one of the he was a teacher at the School for the Deaf in Berkeley. He was the first deaf adult to write a book about being a deaf adult. His book was titled Deaf Adult Speaks Out. And I'm I'm disabled. I had a I had an accident. I didn't want to bring it up in these conversations because I'd take too much information away from what my code of experience is. But being disabled, I was in a wheelchair in high school, and Leo Jacobs was the one that talked to me and says, You can do it. You can go to college." And he wrote a letter of support for me, and I got a grant based on his letter. And no one in school, none of the counselors at my high school, no one thought I would actually graduate from high school. Um, and I had determination, and Leo Jacobs was the adult figure that said, "You can do it." And what an inspiration. And I went off to get more degrees than the hearing professionals said I couldn't do it.
I'm proud of you. I think we all proud of you, Vince. Yeah, we're all proud of you.
No, this is CODA.
Yes, you're right. We're all CODAs here. I'm not sure, Paula, did you see the question that we have for the group? So I know, but I can repeat it again. And the question is, what is the one thing that you wish that the deaf community or the hearing community could know about kids of deaf adults or adult CODAs? So do you want to share something about that? Yes, actually I can. I think it's exposure. I think it's important to allow children to be able to hear that, that they're not a hearing person. Because I grew up in linguistic signing environment using LSM, but I can hear, I'm a CODA, but I don't identify myself as hearing because I'm a melodoid. So I'm fully intergenerated. So
Integrated.
yeah, I'm very integrated. So yes, having the opportunities, because when we talk about language development, that's the exposure. Like, what is your language plan in your home? Well, what does that look like? How they acquire language for CODAs. What does that look like? A lot of parents don't know. The educational system, they decide. So do they get signing support? Can you ask for that? Sure, you can. So having that discussion to be able to make sure that that's being taught and supported. When you talked about ongoing learning for myself, for example, yes, that's true. When you have in the deaf world, we learn, we're a collectivist community. We learn, and whatever we learn, we share it back with our community. I think we do the same thing as CODAs. The educational system, and it's important for them to know what our needs are for CODAs. And for the children, if they want to have a goal as being an interpreter, that's fine. Well, what's your language plan at your home? Some children do brokering at home, outside. And in the international area, there's no ADA like in the United States and other countries. So there are a lot of children who are still brokering between languages. So, and how do we support them? So I have 3 tips. One is no interpreting for violent situations, not having these children interpret any situation that's violent, if, and not being exposed to blood. And then I think parents know, their gut feelings will tell them whether or not that person or that child can briefly interpret, depending on their age, how much. I think that benefits them because in their brains, they're using that core, and it just increases their intelligence tenfold. It's already been researched and it's fact. A lot of CODAs are brilliant because they're multilingual, they're bilingual instead of monolingual individuals. And that has not because we say so, because we're CODAs in our life's experience, but it's people that's been verified and researched and did studies across not just here in the United States, but all around the world. Because how often do we switch between different languages? Whereas what Vinny explained earlier is like, what do parents know? I mean, the children already know. They're already practicing and working and brokering and interpreting. They're building a very strong cognition and linguistics. They're already building those skills, and the opportunity for them to become an interpreter in the future, sure, because of all these different situations, maybe because of it's a job situation, they have those skills to be able to sign. And then by the time a deaf person wants to interpret, get a job or whatever, they can interpret that. I think there's a lot of wonderful opportunities for them. It's important for them to know what that language plan is and help them develop that. And what does that look like? With my son is a grandchild of a deaf adult, very fortunate to have deaf grandparents. And my son has had to learn several visual sign languages because they're deaf. And also the Spanish speaking and English speaking members of our family. Do jobs require them to be if he needs to be an interpreter? That's up to him. But he has that already developed because that was the language plan at home. And he can be able to navigate complex communications. Deaf children and coded children, it's very important that they get that language exposure, acquisition with lots of love and support. Okay, let me go back to, well, this is Grace. In a moment, we're going to switch the moderation back to Kavita soon. But if anybody else, we're almost running out of time. So any quick last burning comment from anyone?
I'd like to make a comment. This is Oral. I know we're short on time, but I definitely want to provide some input as to how we can share resources and information with other CODAs. One thing we can do, and I know that for myself, I feel like I wish I had had someone to expose me and teach me to these things and tell me about my CODA identity so I could have that esteem and that pride in my own identity and understanding of what it meant. I think that would help with navigating life. But for me, I realized that writing music, writing poetry has helped me, and it's been my outlet. I feel and I hope that CODAs can find their own creative, healthy, safe way to meditate, to decompress, to experience mindfulness, and to express your thoughts and feelings through some type of creative art or something that will help you process your identity. I know that it's hard for me, and I got lucky that I was able to have the success and I'm thriving the way I am. And it's also important to share information such as resources like CODA Camp. I never went to a CODA camp, ever. My parents didn't have the information on it, plus our budget was tight. So it's important to set up partnerships with programs and camps within the community like CSD, Schools for the Deaf, or other organizations. And I think it's important to not only create those, but encourage more partnerships of the such through workshops or other type of events, and invite parents within the deaf community that have CODAs, because it's critical to have communication early on between parents and children and have an open, safe, and effective mode of communication. And it doesn't mean that parents will always be able to depend on their children for interpreting, but they can have dialogue and a full relationship. And kids can learn early how to sign. I knew when I was young the power of communication and the power of facilitating communication. I was only 5 or 6 then, and it had a huge impact. It had a lasting mark on me. And like I said, it was something that I felt was heavy and very weightful. But as a CODA, learn to express yourself because communication is the key.
I agree with you 100%. And that's why when we established CODA West, an organization, a nonprofit organization, we recognize that need. And also they set up a camp, and there's CODA Heart, and there's other CODA organizations, but it's not enough. These are organizations that serve children of deaf parents. So these CODA kids, and they need that focus, they need that support. In California, in Northern California, there is a camp called Camp Grizzly, and I love it. And I love it very much. They work with, and it's a camp for deaf and CODA children. It's a rich experience. It was truly wonderful. And we need more camps like Camp Grizzly that builds the deaf and CODA experience together. And there's only one international organization. That's not enough, is it? We need more around the world. It's important for their mental health, their self-esteem. I've seen so many CODAs that are oppressed being felt that they're not part of the deaf community, and they're also not acknowledged or appreciated in the hearing community. But we need to collaborate and work together as one big family. And that's the goal, to heal from the trauma. And the only way we can do that is through all these different organizations like CAD, global, international, organizations like Camp Grizzly, all of us working together to heal through the trauma together, both deaf and CODAs. I want to thank you all. Yes, Paola? Yes, Kavita, I wanted to let you know that I formally supported one program that I can't remember the name of it exactly, but it's an international camp action. And it was for young deaf and CODAs, but there was one camp and it was on the island of Haiti. And secondly, also in Guatemala, which I attended. And their goal was to create a more unified community between the children who sign and then of CODAs and deaf children. It was a 2-week program, and it was an amazing result that came from that. The CODA children were able to sign, and the deaf parents were just amazed and thinking, wow, these children now are signing openly, and their self-esteem has increased because the worldview in their country where they were living wasn't always positive. But after the 2 weeks of them all working together, the parents were just amazed and they felt so proud of their children. And then the opposite, the deaf children with hearing parents, they saw these deaf children signing away with all of these other kids, and the hearing parents felt very overwhelmed because they couldn't understand their signing deaf child, and they're expressing themselves and their feelings through sign language. So we played some various games like math games, educational types of games at the camp, and everybody would raise their hands, and they're so eagerly wanting to express that. And CODAs and deaf kids, they were teasing one another, and the parents were like, why are they behaving that way? Why are they doing that? And it's like showing the parents, it's like, wow, just innate in their experiences and what they bring to the table and what comes naturally in that environment between the two. So it's their spirit, it's their values, the shared experiences and values of one another. And that has increased a better awareness and positive sense of self and self-esteem and mental health. I mean, it is not the discussion for those on the outside, you know, sharing their experiences, whatever, but it's really about us and it's about the members within that group. Let them have that experience. We have gone through that trauma. And I know that it's really hard for deaf people who may not have children to go ahead and say, well, you know, they haven't really experienced that. I really feel that, you know, again, you know, maybe you have friends that are deaf that have CODA children and learn from that experience. But oftentimes these comments come from people that don't understand because they haven't lived that experiences. And they're like, oh, deaf, I mean, that's it. But during young deaf adults, they don't understand until they have those children and they carry their own traumas and they pass that down to their children, and that filters into the community. So we all need to heal. We all have lessons to learn from one another, and it's about building unity. That was very beautiful, Paula. That was beautiful. Everything that you said, amazing. Thank you. Yes, we do need to try and find and build resources and work together to establish these services. So hopefully we can gather once again and talk about how we can establish, you know, better mental health awareness and promote more healing and not continue the perpetuation of trauma. That CODAs and deaf people want to be divisive, and we don't need to do that. That's what the next steps are. So I'm very sorry, but time has run out. I'm sure we can all talk about this topic all night. I want to thank each and every one of you. Yes, that's right. It's about unity. Yep. Deaf and CODAs. That's right. We're beautiful fabric and people in our community. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you for our interpreters, Molly and Chris. Thank you for your fabulous job and behind the scenes who are helping us and supporting our platform. So if you are interested in learning more about future topics or watching future events and you have some ideas, please send it to info@cad1906.org and let us know if you have any ideas that you think that you would like for us to investigate and provide future events and platforms and panelists. Please. Also, we would welcome your sponsorship to help us continue to provide these events to you. Thank you all, and good night. Bye-bye. Good night, everyone.